right now starting the webinar. I would like to ask everyone to mute their microphones for the moment. And I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar Roma on the Fringes of Citizenship in Europe. This webinar is part of a series of migration series seminars, New Approaches to Migration Theory and Research, organized by the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. And before I introduce our guest speakers, just a few technicalities. The webinar will last up to 1.5 hours. And the presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. And during the presentation, you're very welcome to write down your questions and comments in the chat. And we will relate to them after the presentations, and the speakers will have a chance to reply to your questions. Now, let me introduce our guest speakers. We have the first speaker is Julija Sardelić, who is a political sociologist and a socio-legal scholar with a general research interest in citizenship and migration, including minority rights, statelessness, and forced migration. And her main research focus has been on the position of Romani minorities as marginalized citizens in Europe, and also on how the refugee crisis has affected the politics of diversity in Europe. Currently, she's a lecturer at the Political Science and International Relations program at Victoria University of Wellington. And her book, The Fringes of Citizenship, Romani Minorities and Civic Marginalization, is in press with Manchester University Press. Now, our second speaker is Andrzej Mirga, who is an ethnologist, an analyst, and activist, and currently he is a member of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. But prior to that, he has served as the chair of the Roma Education Fund. He headed also the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. He served also at the Committee of Experts on Roma and Travelers of the Council of Europe, and also at various commissions relating to Roma, headed by the European Commission. He's extremely well published, the author also of one of the most important books about Roma in Poland, which he wrote together with Lech Mróz, the co-author of a widely cited manifesto, The Roma in the 21st Century, and among others, the co-editor of the book Realizing Roma Rights and the Roma in European Higher Education, Recasting Identities, Reimagining Futures. Now, our third speaker is Michał Garapich, who is a social anthropologist specializing in the issue of migration, ethnicity, nationalism, multiculturalism, also social resistance, homelessness, and of course, migration from Poland. And since 2005, Michał Garapich has conducted numerous research projects, and at the moment his work focuses on migration of Polish Roma. And there, as a result of his actually 2 research projects related to Roma, is also text coming up on the critical analysis actually of academic silence about the lack of Roma in Polish migration studies and Polish Romani studies. And this is forthcoming in Critical Romani Studies. So I would like to welcome our first speaker, Julija Sardelić. If you can, please, the floor is yours, or so to say, the screen is yours. And please, if you can share your screen, you're very welcome.
Marta, thank you very much for this lovely welcome. Just to check if everything is working, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well, and I have to, sorry, I have to unpin you right now, remove spotlight, and gosh.
Okay, it seems I'm having a little bit of trouble, but I hope this will work now. Okay, it's not allowing me for some reason to do, can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to make...
Start the presentation. You need to start the presentation, and I think then it will be full screen.
Let me see. So slideshow.
Slideshow, yes. Mm-hmm. Play from start.
Excellent. Oh, okay.
There
my apologies for that. So Marta, thank you very much for this wonderful welcome. And I would like to start with a few thank you notes before I start talking. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Migration Research at the University of Warsaw for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm really honored to be on it and to be with on the panel with two very distinguished speakers that I respect a lot and their work a lot. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And also thank you to everyone for being here this morning. I know it's 9 o'clock in the morning in Europe, and this is like just the first beginning of week coffee lecture, I guess. So I'm really grateful that you're all here, like basically first thing Monday morning. And also I'm grateful because it's 9 o'clock in the evening here in New Zealand. And it's good that I can have like also like one humane hour to present. So, kia ora koto katoa, just to greet you in Maori, indigenous New Zealand language, lacho divas in Romani language. So the presentation that I'm going to have today is entitled Roma and the Fringes of Citizenship in Europe. And as Marta already said, I'm a lecturer in political science at Terenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. However, just before we start, I have to say that basically I have been like all over the place. So my former line manager, Peter Vermeers, has joked that I'm like an academic nomad because I had positions I finished my PhD at the University of Ljubljana, but that held position at University of Edinburgh, European University Institute, University of Liverpool, and University of Leuven in Belgium. And now I'm at the Victoria University of Wellington, Terenga Waka. So sometimes I joke I had to go so far away to like also change the color of the logo of the university where I work. I also wanted to mention that I have a decade-long experience of working as a human rights activist with Roma communities in Southeast Europe, especially with Romani children. So I was working in different communities, from doing things like tutoring Romani children and so on, and helping them to get through high school, especially in communities where most children did not finish high school and further education. So before I start with today's presentation, this is some of my previous work. I have focused on the position of Roma as citizens of forced migrants, and I particularly focused on countries of former Yugoslavia. I was born myself in former Yugoslavia, and basically what I looked at how the position of Romani minorities has changed as citizens after the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And I have also, of course, looked at the position of Roma as refugees, internally displaced, and other forced migrants. I have also looked at the dynamics between EU and EU accession countries, so countries that also wanted to access and are still in the process of negotiations for the EU membership. And I have also focused on all this from the citizenship studies perspective. And one of the focuses that I had, and also wrote basically one of the reports for the minority rights group on statelessness. In my today's presentation, I'm going to again focus in the domain of citizenship and migration studies. More specifically, as Marta mentioned, I do qualitative socio-legal research. And in today's presentation, I'm going to present some of the things that are coming in my book. And it's going to be qualitative socio-legal analysis focusing on the position of Roma as marginalized citizens in Europe, rather just focusing on Roma as an exceptional minority that does not fit. So many reports, many media reports, but also like reports that we read from policymakers actually focus on Roma rather than as being part of citizenry. They focus it on Roma as an exceptional minority, and they're trying to find why Roma do not actually fit. As I mentioned, and Marta also mentioned, this is primarily based on my upcoming book with Manchester University Press in 2021, and this is the cover of the book. The research that I'm going to present today is conducted under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie research project Investit Rom, which was done under the supervision of Professor Peter Vermeersch from the University of Leuven. The title of the research was Invisible Edges of Citizenship, Readdressing the Position of Romani Minorities in Europe. Before I start, I want to also reflect on my own positionality, as it was suggested as one of the first issues of critical Romani studies. So, of course, as I also reflect in my introduction to the book, I am not the one who will be speaking in the name of Roma. This would be really one of the cardinal racist sins if I did that. But what I'm trying to do in my book is actually scrutinize the liberal democratic citizenship rather than also objectifying Roma in research. I think that if we think about Romani minorities, Romani individuals as citizens since 2020, I will go back to the country where I was born, to Slovenia, and to the European Court of Human Rights case entitled Hudorovic and others versus Slovenia, which had a decision made in March 2020. This case, so at the European Court of Human Rights, was deciding whether or not Slovenia has violated the right to privacy and the European Convention of Human Rights to two Romani communities which did not have access to drinking water. As Amnesty International, as European Roma Rights Center and other NGOs have shown, Roma in many different countries, including Slovenia, many Roma do not have access to drinking water. But why did particularly Slovenia end up at the court, European Court of Human Rights? It is because in 2016, the government of Slovenia amended the constitution saying that everybody in Slovenia should have the right to drinking water. This was actually done in collaboration with different environmental NGOs, and also basically NGOs that were advocating that water should not be there for profit, but should be accessible to every individual in Slovenia. However, what is interesting, when this was adopted, then when the Romani citizens of Slovenia said, okay, we do not have right to drinking water because we do not have in our settlements right to access drinking water. The government of Slovenia in this Hudorovic case said that the government pointed out that in the illegally, I'm citing this, of course, constructed buildings were not allowed to be connected to public utility infrastructure facilities such as drinking water supply and discharge of wastewater, emphasizing in this regard that the applicable laws applied uniformly to everyone, and further arguing that any provisions to the contrary would amount to discrimination against the majority vis-a-vis the Roma community. Of course, I found this discourse quite problematic because it actually ignores the history and how Romani settlements have been constructed in the first place, and ignores involvement of government that did not allow many of the Romani settlements and many of Romani individuals to actually buy the land and so on, and now saying that they cannot be connected to basically to drinking water supply because that would be discrimination of majority. The argument of basically the discrimination of majority is not new, but we see, I'll come back to that in a second. So we see that during different crises, the position of Roma has been highlighted. Also in 2015-16 refugee crisis, we saw a very infamous statement by then Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, who said, after all, let's be honest, we aren't even capable of integrating our own Romani fellow citizens, of whom we have hundreds of thousands. How can we integrate people who are from somewhere completely else when it comes to lifestyle and religion? But the problem is that when we see a position of Roma highlighted in the media, it would seem that Roma are basically in this state of exception only when we have crisis. the argument of my book is that that's not the case, that actually that's the state of normality, and that basically cultural racism has been there present even when we do not have like states of exceptions and different crises. The argument where like the majority would be discriminated because minority would get certain rights that other citizens have is not actually new. It has been done in different cases. Also, for example, when settler colonial states, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in 2007 rejected the Universal Declaration of on the Rights of Indigenous People, they said, okay, we cannot redress the land rights, we cannot give the veto power over Indigenous affairs to Indigenous people, because that would be discriminating the majority who do not have this power. Of course, this argument is problematic and ignores all the history and marginalization and subordination of Indigenous people in these countries that have lost, that had their land stolen, and also did not have any right to decide on their own affairs. And this brings us back to like the old saying from that we know very well from Animal Farm, but I just like actually rephrased it a little bit differently, that all citizens are equal, but some citizens are more equal than others. And in this case, when we ignore all the histories behind how, for example, Indigenous people and Roma in Europe have been positioned in a way they're positioned, then we do get these taxonomies where certain majorities have rights taken for granted while they are denied to minority citizens. Try to go further. The question that I ask in my book is, how can we actually explain this theoretically? Why do we have certain minorities that are actually basically not given rights that they should have as a citizen? And my suggestion is to introduce two terms, that is invisible edges of citizenship and the fringes of citizenship. And I have contemplated the position of Roma as citizens rather than an exceptional minority that does not fit as many of the government policy makers like to claim. Just to like put the definition of citizenship out there, so citizenship usually represents a bond between an individual and a country, and this bond is framed in the terms of membership status and rights and belonging. So status that somebody has a legal status like citizen, rights, access to education, employment, and so and healthcare and so on, but also belonging. And I have introduced two definitions of invisible edges of citizenship and fringes of citizenship. Invisible edges of citizenship I have defined in my book as policies, legislation, and practices that contribute to marginalization of Roma, yet they do not specifically target them, but all citizens, either on the national or EU level. These are broader and cannot be directly encompassed by Romaphobia or anti-Gypsyism, but the edges of citizenship demonstrate where inclusion of all citizens is limited and at the same time creates a space in which Roma became disproportionately represented. And this space I call the fringes of citizenship, a space created by invisible edges of citizenship where marginalized minorities are manifestly included through like different minority legislation and so on. However, at the same time, they are latently marginalized as citizens. And in my book, I discuss different examples of this. For example, I discussed the position of Roma on the fringes of EU citizenship. We know that different EU institutions are paying special attention to Roma. For example, we had the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies. Then Copenhagen accession criteria did put a lot of emphasis on minority rights. However, at the same time, when it comes to rights that all EU citizens should have, it's very interesting, and that has happened in scholarship as well. Roma have been framed as migrants rather as EU citizens that are practicing, for example, the rights to freedom of movement as all citizens have. This framing is problematic because we see in a lot of like scholarship that we see that there is certain emphasis on Roma as migrants, but sometimes we think also the problem is that like Roma are considered to be migrants and their migration should be considered as problematic. But the case is that like there's not really a lot of mobile Romani EU citizens. All the research that has actually been done has shown that Roma are not more mobile than other EU citizens. However, as I shown in this different newspaper articles, Roma have been deterritorialized, and there was a nomadization on the basis of cultural racism that denied rights that should belong to all citizens. The other thing that I have analyzed particularly is different court cases in the European Court of Human Rights that were dealing with segregation of Romani children, and especially focusing on Ursus and others versus Croatia citizenship basically case, because I argued here that even through the education system, there are fringes of citizenship being created. So what I looked at when analyzing the different court cases, I looked at how government legitimized segregation of Romani children. And in the case of Croatia, they said, okay, Romani children have to be in different classes because of language barriers. And the argumentation continued that in order to become like other citizens, Roma needs to be actually in these separate classes so they can catch up. And there was also arguments from this coming from different, for example, principles saying that if Roma are in the same classes, that's actually discrimination of majority, which is of course very problematic. Basically, this case was at the European Court of Human Rights as a very crucial moment. That's when Croatia was still an EU candidate and Roma were still EU citizens to become. And it was connected to EU conditionality. However, what was enough for like Croatia to be accepted as an EU member state was that they introduced a national strategy where they said they will abolish Roma-only classes by 2020. Of course, the classes have not been abolished. They're still there to the present day in many different schools in Croatia. So it was enough to have like a commitment, which actually never happened. The other thing that I focused on was Roma and the Fringes of Statelessness, because we do have the Convention on the Status of Stateless Persons at the UN. However, for example, in the case of former Yugoslavia, many Roma have found themselves in a position that they were not able to prove their citizenship, but at the same time, they were not able to sufficiently prove that they are stateless, because like there was always constantly a claim that no, they must be citizens of certain countries, even if they're not able to prove it. So they were like, in my work, I have shown that they were actually in this legal limbo. And there were in citizenship acquisitions after state integration that happened both in the Czechoslovakian case, but also in the case of former Yugoslavia. There were many seemingly neutral provisions for citizenship acquisition that actually ended up discriminating and depriving Roma of citizenship. And I also, how much time do I have left, Marta?
You have, well, 4 more minutes.
Okay, good, because okay. I'm like going a little bit, okay, then I can slow down a little bit. I'm almost in the end, so it's not going to be full 20 minutes. So, and the other thing that I also analyzed in the book is Roma as future EU citizens on the fringes of refugeehood. So the position of Roma who have been refugees, for example, in Germany, and have had the dulding status from the late 90s, has shown that the question that we need to see is like, what do we do like with belonging? So where does somebody who has been born, for example, in Germany belong, even though like if their parents have, for example, Kosovo citizenship and so on, and these are the countries that they have never seen and so on. Of course, when we saw the end of conflicts in former Yugoslav space, we also saw that many countries in the European Union started returning, so deportations of people who had formerly had like a Duldung status, so basically not to be deported. And many times this has been presented as voluntary repatriation, where they were like nothing but voluntary. Many children who have been born during this time, for example, in different EU member states, have not known the countries that their parents were from, but yet they were still returned there. And also what has been ignored in these deportations is that in many cases, especially in Kosovo, there have been still persecution of Roma going on, and it was definitely not safe for these minorities to be returned. On the other hand, we also saw when there was visa liberalization of different Western Balkan states that actually does encompass different post-Yugoslav states, we also saw that that basically when this visa liberalization mechanism was introduced, we saw the rise of asylum seekers who identified as belonging to Romani minorities. And what the EU Parliament then decided is that they will suppress, they will put the visa-free suspension mechanism if there will be more asylum seekers coming from these countries. Of course, this is actually something that is not new. It has happened before, for example, in the Czech Republic, when people who have been identified as Romani individuals were not allowed to board a plane to go to the UK because there was like a perception that they might seek asylum in the UK. And in the case of visa liberalization that happened already in 2009, there was like basically that because of this visa suspension mechanism, the Macedonian border control police did not allow many of its own Romani citizens to leave their own country because they saw that they might actually endanger the visa-free regime for these countries. And again, this was violating the rights of minority citizens to keep the rights of like basically majority citizens. Very brief conclusions. What I conclude in my book is that the fringes of citizenship show that liberal democratic citizenship cannot be considered as truly inclusive if it keeps recreating exclusion of certain groups of citizens. And the position of Romani citizens is not simply a position of an exceptional minority does not fit, but through civic marginalization, that is produced by the invisible edges of citizenship, the citizenship fringes are created. So basically, there are policies and legislation that constantly reproduce the marginalization. So Roma citizens are just not just out there like on the fringes, but they're constantly being put there by certain policies and legislation, as I analyze in my book. And I argue that we need to reconceptualize citizenship through legislation and policies, because as long as it is not truly inclusive for all citizens, without looking for excuses, it is not what it claims to be, that is liberal democratic citizenship. Thank you very much for your attention, and all questions, comments are welcome and highly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julija, for this very interesting speech and presentation. I would encourage everyone to actually put the questions into the chat, and we will read them at the end of all the presentations. Yes, I would like to welcome right now Andrzej Mirga to start his talk and share his presentation. You need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Now is okay?
Yep. Yes, now we can hear you. And now you need to start sharing your screen.
Yes. I have to speak. How would you share it? Okay. No.
Okay, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a green square saying share screen. And if you click on it, it will ask you which part of your computer you want to share.
Do you see the green share screen button?
Yeah, down, share screen.
Yes, then you have to click it, and then you should see which part, I mean, it should show, is your presentation open on your screen? You need to...
I have another computer.
Oh, no, then it has to be, the presentation has to be on that computer.
Oh.
Okay, maybe you can send your, oh,
Yeah.
started
Oh,
sharing.
it started sharing, but it shows only Zoom. We would need, you see, you started sharing, but you started sharing not the presentation. Maybe we can start, if you could maybe, either if the presentation is crucial, then if you can send it via email to us, then we will share it for you. And if not, then then you can start maybe without the presentation.
Okay.
What is the decision? Would you like us to try to?
I will send you later. Okay.
Okay, but
start,
you would like to start speaking now, yes?
now.
Okay, then maybe if you could stop sharing your screen for that moment, then that would be great. Okay, then we see you basically, and
Perfect. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Julija for presentation and for coming book. I would love to read it and to comment eventually. My presentation will be focusing on European citizenship, but as the way to overcome Roma minority marginalization at national level and progress with minority status recognition and redistribution. I will try also to answer why state Roma programs supported and enforced by the EU are not working. That is whether these programs are based on genuine commitment or just a window dressing because Roma minority are not a political player at national level. And finally, I will argue that empowering and empowerment requires Roma to develop social capital that may change part of their culture, but increase their political power in the state and society. At one, I consider myself an enthusiast of the EU integration, and because of that, my views on the EU especially and Roma might be biased. Following on this, I consider fortunate that the EU, in a more direct and strong ways, is addressing the Roma in its space and beyond. The EU citizenship became more relevant for Roma with the enlargement process of 2004 and later on with 2007, when a significant number of Roma entered the EU space, though Roma population in so-called old EU countries did use the EU citizenship rules. This does not imply that some Roma have gained the EU citizenship in expense of their previous citizenship rights in nation states. Free movement of people, services, and capital in the EU space do not take away the citizenship individuals have. I distinguish here those Roma who have citizen of a given state and form a minority there, at the same time use the EU citizenship to move freely, and Roma who are third country nationals seeking refuge and asking for protection, temporal or as stateless persons. Marginality for me means or relates to inequality. Inequality or differential treatment, discriminatory by nature, generates marginalization. If that reasoning is correct, Roma civil society has been addressing it and exposing it since very early. The same were doing non-Roma scholars who research Roma in most of the cases, marginalized layers of the community. This was the case before the transition and after. But with the transition, this marginalization became exposed. And according to newly developed civil society, Roma, including Roma and international organizations, the state, whose Roma minority were citizens, have had a responsibility to find remedies and improve their status. That was new, demanding the demand to get rid of unequal or differential treatment resulting in continuous marginalization. This is also the way Roma minority issues get on the agenda of the major international organizations. Those fora themselves, built up by the states, they were intergovernmental, scrutinized the situation of Roma in various countries and demanded redress, following here on demands coming from the Roma, some states, in international organizations and human rights organizations. No doubt, marginalization was an issue and remained as such. See, for example, Barani's study of '92, who set up a standard view on this, but also the FRAS report on Roma that illustrates well this point. In this sense, data collected on Roma at the country's level and in all areas from education, employment to housing or health, and later on anti-gypsies, indicate a rather disquieting picture. The gap that have been existing between Roma in given country and the majority, for some Roma justifying migration and for some states policy of evictions, finally mobilized the EU Council to adopt the framework for national Roma strategies. Certainly, the situation in Italy in 2008, adoption of emergency decrees because of Roma migrants, and the situation with Roma migrants in France in 2009 and 2010 pushed the Commission to respond with such a document. Pressured by the old EU member states to stop Roma migration, for example, France, and by Roma and pro-Roma civil society organizations advocating in favor of more EU in resolving Roma marginalization, including such persons as George Soros, motivated the Commission to come up with it. I consider it a threshold in the EU effort to engage itself and mobilize member states for action to get rid of Roma marginalization, that is to ensure equality of Roma citizens before the law and in practice. I am far from considering Roma as a truly European minority or transnational minority. I should add here that the concept of transnationality of Roma, in my view, was always a useful political tool to pressure national governments, but not an objective in itself. Even EU in the 90s was afraid to take the offer of Indians and become Indian minority in Europe, as it would mean, such arguments were used, that we would lose our citizenship among European states. Whether Roma were seen in terms of cultural racism or simply racism, this does not change the fact that Roma were alien, others, or second-class citizens in given society or state. On the other hand, ethnic movements or any social movements aims to become political, and politics offers the best tool to gain visibility and mobilize people. That was and is obviously also the case of Roma in Europe. Second, why the EU framework is not bringing expected results? According to Naidenova and Matarazzo from 2019 report, the EU funds have failed to improve the lives of Roma because of these 5 main elements. First, lack of Roma participation. The second, weak governance and coordination. 3, lack of data on Roma. 4, lack of robust monitoring of spent funds. And 5, lack of anti-Gypsy approach. In my view, there are more reasons for failure. One of is lack of political will and commitment to act at the national and local level. The second, doing things on paper just to fulfill the criteria for accession. Third, racist domination and hegemonic power of the state and majorities society that justify racist discourse for Roma, making them or their culture responsible for the situation of marginalization. 4, massive issue to be resolved and costly, by the way, ignored for long. And 5, lack of human and capital and social capital of a minority, most epitomized in difficulty in self-organizing. Most reasonable and short answer would be the EU member states and accessing countries did not follow on suggested recommended interventions with a commitment of political will sufficient to ensure positive results. In other words, states and their agencies remain prejudiced against Roma and were not motivated politically to pursue the objectives of the framework. Roma themselves, weak political actors, met with inaction or window dressing policy of the state. In parentheses, in 2003, the Project on Ethnic Relations from Princeton brought a number of Roma representatives and leaders to Brussels to meet and discuss the issue of Roma before accession in 2004. At this meeting with the Commission and MEPs from the European Parliament, we have heard for the first time that as Roma, we have a window of opportunities to demand some provisions from candidate countries before accession. Once states are in or joining the club, they are setting rules, but the Commission has no tools to make them following some rules. It took several years for the Commission and some member states to change that, though some new member states stood up, however, to their political commitments. For example, Poland under Tusk, but not under the current government. With infringement proceedings and lastly, discuss conditionality, 2 countries objected to that. We are approaching new era in which Brussels seems to have tools to measure its member state performance, also regarding the framework for Roma. For me, it is important that the commitment of the Commission to have post-2020 strategy is there, and that with the new tools eventually approved, conditionality rules, the Commission will pressure the EU member states including regarding implementation of a revised EU Roma strategy. Point 3. Empowering and empowerment requires Roma to develop social capital that may change part of their culture, but increase their political power in the state and society. The EU and some governments in the last several years have recognized anti-Gypsies, for example, in Germany, and arrived at the conclusion that without addressing it, no much progress in social inclusion and integration of Roma can be reached. This is from FRA 2018. This phenomenon impacts in many ways the situation of Roma in given society, not the least in area of education. It requires from Roma developing social capital that would eventually increase their political power. Schooling is one of major networks that builds up social capital, a key for other forms of capital, human and economic, main factors for educational achievements of Roma child. A power issue exposes the tension between the interests of government and society to have Roma problems solved by making Roma more alike to majority, that is, to education, and that of the Romani movement. In this latter case, the objective is to have the Roma ethnic community evolving and becoming a political player, as Magari and Agarin suggest, reaching the level of participation as influence from 2015. In their view, participation as presence is but the first building block for effective participation, leading to participation as voice, whilst only with participation as influence does a minority group ensure a degree of control over institutions and policies which affect them. Or influence allows minorities to enjoy substantive voice as agents of policymaking. They insist, therefore, on effective participation of ordinary Roma and claim that if attention is not given to participation of ordinary Roma, then efforts to address central issues of concern for Roma can at best achieve partial success or be futile altogether. It seems especially difficult to realize empowerment as influence among ordinary Roma, of whom 80% are living in risk of poverty, taking FRA as an example from 2018. And only 3% of young Roma aged 20 to 24 are still completing education. Such ordinary Roma are far from daily politics. Similarly, it is illusory to expect them that they will change negative group ascription. Effective participation as influence is concomitant with more numerous and well-educated strata of Roma communities who can exercise various intellectual roles in society and in the movement, leadership or expert role. The kind of social capital Roma developed or possess and the conditions that the dominant group imposed upon them determine the level of Roma community exclusion or integration, as Magari and Agarin suggest, the level of their participation as influence. Neither the family background or those who live in the risk of poverty, nor income, nor participation in social networks enable members of these communities as poor and excluded gain higher social capital. Therefore, the poverty rates effectively limit the chances of developing bridging capital. Effective participation as influence, therefore, will not happen until we will significantly raise higher education participation rates. However, increases in segregation, despite all the efforts to desegregate schools, are a worrying development and eventually contribute to bonding capital in group orientation and effectively weaken the bridging one conducted to the child's higher achievement rates in education. It is a paradox because the bridging capital can work in the interest of the majority, that is making Roma, especially children and youth, more like the majority. Partly, a study of Echenige and Freyer from 2007 explained this for Black students. As their share of the student population increases, segregation increases dramatically, they are saying. Schools that have 25% or more Black students exhibit severe within school racial segregation of social interactions. To conclude, the cost in the form of assimilative pressure associated with social inclusion policies need to be uncovered. Policy of distribution must be combined with politics of recognition that encourage ethnic pride, belonging, or identity. An example of ERIAC. Participation as influence will not happen until we raise together a higher education participation rate significantly. Education means empowerment and, as a result, influence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring and rich talk. And now I give immediately the floor to Michał Garapich.
Thank you very much, Marta. You can hear me well, I hope. Yes, thank you. Hello, Julija. Hello, Marta and Andrzej. I'm really happy to see you. First of all, thank you for Marta for organizing this and for for us to be able to bounce ideas around. And these ideas stem from mutual common interests, but obviously we are all different. We also use different conceptual kind of nets to understand reality, what's around us. So my little talk will be slightly different in that sense that I will just tell one story of one individual whom I met during my last few years of research, and I will try to kind of understand his life or his trajectory in concept of my. I mean, in the light of what you said, and also in the light of what Julija has written and generously has shared before the book is out, it's a very brave thing to do, to kind of release the draft before it's in print, before actually it's in print. So thank you very much, Julija. Again, it was very inspiring, and so these are my. I mean, I'll, as a matter of introduction, I will just actually, I'm telling you these things because, in a way, as Julija started as well, that we not claim, and I don't claim to speak on behalf of anyone, and in particularly for Roma, who were deprived of voice in academia, in public, in public discourse, in politics, as Andrzej has mentioned. I just claim to met a particular person, to spend hours and hours talking to him, and obviously, as we all try to do in the academia, to understand why he does what he does, and why he says what he says, and what it means for our further advancement of understanding of these issues, and for Roma, but also for non-Roma, for Gajo world, for structures of state, of oppression, of also of trying to, the right word would be to end these structures of oppression, but obviously we know it's not possible. So as a matter of introduction, I have to say these things because I don't have a title page for my slides, but this is a webinar, this is not a lecture, so I guess Marta allows, and OBM and Central Migration Study allows for a certain degree of improvisation and non-formal talk. Okay, so okay, I just need to kind of still start. So if I may, can you see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Marta. So just as a matter of broad introduction, I just want to say a few things about what I do Basically, last few years, when we were running a project at the Center for Migration Studies with the University of Warsaw with Kamila Fiałkowska and Ela Mirga. And at the moment there is a continuation of that project, but I won't talk about this much. But the project aimed basically to tell a not heard and unknown so far broader story of Polish Roma migration in a longer time perspective. That's what I try to understand. And wherever it's from Second World War, more precisely from the end of communism. And it relates to both internal and international mobility. But the key thing here is that it's a history, it's a story from below. So story told by its participants, by people who lived through that. And so there's a lot of kind of oral history, but also history that is still present, still has repercussions in people's today's lives. So there are, for people who are more interested in that, please look at our publications. There are more to come. But more broadly, if I may talk about stories and narratives, obviously this is where I come from, in the sense that narratives are what probably makes us humans, as Brunner calls us homo narrans, so people who, or species who are obsessively linked with storytelling, with narratives, with acts of meaning making. And obviously narratives have different audiences, styles and purposes. We tell things for many different reasons, okay? And in this case, we obviously hear a lot of stories about negotiating hostile state policies, or more broadly speaking, the Gadget word, okay? The word that of states, of politics, of treaties, of power that determines lives of not only Roma, but those who are on the receiving end, or who are basically the weaker actors in that long historical process. And the story we hear, and I hear the last few years, are stories of negotiation of these hostile state policies in this phase, in the flesh of migration regimes, in the form of migration regimes. And these stories are obviously, this is where I particularly pay attention to these stories, because they are stories of very often of agency, of resistance, of explaining why I did what I did. And in that sense, I'm very fond of James Scott ways of understanding weaker sides, or people who have less power, how they navigate, how they live their lives and try to make sense of it, but also maintain some form of autonomy and resilience. And in that sense, knowledge of state structures is crucial. Okay, Roma, but also any other migrant, and in a hostile environment, so to speak, to use the favorite term in British politics now. Obviously, to navigate that, you have to know these things. So you have to become an expert in a sense. So it's a dynamic, non-static process, retold and again understood by meaning-making narrative acts, because they inform your agency. Okay, in order to act and to do things which make sense, which are rational, which also kind of for you are rational, you have to tell them, you have to make sense of them, you have to, in a way, use discursive tools externally for different purposes, different audiences, but also for your own sanity, in a sense, to understand that what you do is actually meaningful and rational. And this is actually, I allow myself to lift a nice quote from Julija, who actually points that there is still not enough in scholarship understanding of how actually Roma, not activist elite Roma, but how everyday actions of so-called ordinary Roma or majority of Roma are informed by that understanding, how they contest these brilliantly called the invisible edges of citizenship, so the boundaries that are there to cross, both boundaries in a physical meaning of the word, but also those that are made in our heads, are discursive, but also are sort of silently fit or embedded in implicitly embedded in policies or in law, as Julija has brilliantly showed. Okay, so meet Sergio. I met Sergio many times over the course of many conversations in different contexts, interviews, but also informal settings, parties, drinking sessions, etc. He's in his 70s, and he was born in southern Poland. So those of you who know, he's a Carpathian Roma or Brigitka Roma. In early socialist times, he moved to Nowa Huta, so he was part of that internal big migration from rural Poland, especially south, to industrial or to kind of new towns in Poland. As a child, he moved early on, as a teenager, to Wrocław, with a large Roma community, mixed Roma community from many different groups. And he married a girl from Polska Roma, from other group, which which wasn't a common thing to happen, but it did happen, and it obviously made him quite a distinct person because he had connections, family connections with both groups, who otherwise would not be very often interacting. And he was in Wrocław in the 60s and 70s. He was a very keen member of local sports club, where in a kind of Gaja environment, he met many people, and as an outgoing personality, he had quite a lot of social capital. Whether you call it bridging or bonding, doesn't matter in that sense. But he managed to meet a guy who was a state official who had connections with basically communist states, local officials who were basically able to get him a passport. Not only him, but basically passport in the times of restricting mobility outside in the communist regime, as you all know, or younger people might not know. Passports were a very crucial, very precious commodity. People were going to great lengths to get a passport. And so he knew that guy, and then in 1982, a lot of people who were seen as less desirable by the state officials, communist state officials, or who were many different reasons. It's a longer story here. Basically, were encouraged to leave, and a lot of Roma took advantage of that communist policy, or informal policy, really, and got a passport and left. So Sergio was one of that wave, very early wave of migrant, mainly to Germany, where they asked for asylum. Germany, when you listen to Sergio, he tells a quite formative, quite a big story of his experience in Germany, where as an asylum seeker, he was part of a broader movement of mainly Balkan Roma asylum seekers who were denied the right to stay and who staged quite political fight. They were very assertive in fighting German authorities to convince them that they have a right to stay. And if you listen to him, he likes to tell that story where it's a broader story of Roma unity in a sense, in the face of hostile German state, which obviously this is a very fresh story of relationship with German state, fresh emotionally, because as you might remember, in 1980, 81, there was famous hunger strike in Dachau, where Sinti were staging their hunger strike to force Germans to recognize that they were basically guilty of genocide. So Sergio is a very important man in that environment, but he's not it's not a super great known leader. I'm not sure if he figures in any books about this time, but in any way, within his communities or his families he's connected to, he's very often he's very in the early 90s, in the first wave larger wave of Polish Roma migration to the West, he has a very important role. He's acting as a migrant broker, he's facilitating journeys, he helps people to plan, etc. Remember, early 90s is the moment when, as in Yugoslavia and former Yugoslavia, in the other countries, Roma are very often first to be the victims of economic transformation and socialist system collapse. So they want very often first to leave. Sergio is a so-called, in Romani, cibao. Correct me, and the Roma friends might correct me if I kind of pronounce it well. But basically, it's someone, a guy to go to, someone who speaks many languages, someone who connects a lot of different groups, but also has connection with Gadzia world. So Sergio is a cibao. And so he helps a lot of people to migrate, to kind of conduct or to establish migration networks, chain migration, etc. These migration shifts then to England because Germans are not very nice and keen to give asylum. So basically he does the same really in that migration route from Poland to England. But he still maintains that contact with Germany. He has a large family also in Germany, in England. Post EU enlargement, things doesn't change really. He still continues to assist people in mobility, but also obviously he's not super young anymore, so he's not super active. But as a result of that, I mean, if I met him in Poland, but also in England, and he has a flat in both places. He has close family connections to Germany. He frequently moves. Okay, he has a lot of paperwork to kind of organize because he arranges a state pension here. He tries to work a little bit in England. Then he has to move back to Poland because he has to arrange as well some issues related with pensions, with benefits, like a flat. Obviously, he deals with health issues. He's not, as I said, he's not younger anymore. And to be a cibao, it means a lot of meetings with people, a lot of contacts, a lot of sits in, meets, etc. That means as well, you know, a lot of time spent on socializing. So, but obviously he's very active in Roma community politics. It's not a guy who you probably meet in a kind of standard EU-funded NGO. Okay, it's a quite traditional, old-school activism, which is, you know, a smoke-filled room, so to speak. But basically, he's a known guy. So just to kind of start to wrap up and to make sense of that, I think Sergio mobility on broad level reflects mobility in communist Poland and in post-migration, in sort of post-1989 migrations. Very similar to non-Roma mobility, non-Roma Polish citizens mobility, which also had to deal with challenging mobility restrictions from both sides, from communist Poland, but also from the West. And both groups were trying to, using their own resources, to find loopholes to leave Poland and be as creative as possible. Claim asylum, I don't know, but also doing many other things. Obviously, and it's important, Roma are not the only group of Polish citizens also who, after 1989, claimed asylum in the West. Okay, there were a lot of Polish citizens who claimed asylum because they were escaping the army, or they were claiming that they are former communists who were persecuted, or, which is also quite symbolic in that sense, to understand this process, there are a lot of Gadzia, or a lot of instances of Gadzia, of non-Roma people who pretend to be Roma when they ask for asylum in the West, in Britain. It's actually a favorite joke of Roma people when they talk about these times, to recall the times where, oh, you know, there were actually Gadzia who were kind of passing for Roma to be able to navigate through that hostile system. I'm just saying this because the experience of immigration officials, border police, passport controls, employment restrictions, immigration raids, etc. It's a common experience of people living in these times, in the 90s, who are trying to migrate, both Polish citizens, Roma and non-Roma. Both groups who were similarly creative had to, in an incredibly drawn resources they had to also make sense of that structures of hostility and there's there is some anthropological stuff on that by Irek. Well, myself, I wrote about this as well, on the creativity involved in navigating hostile state system and the resilience, but also in kind of moral codes that govern that. As you have to explain to yourself that actually it's okay to morally to work illegally or to try to lie to immigration officials because this is your right. Obviously, we have to understand that toute proportion gardée, Roma were slightly different category here, additionally stigmatized and racialized on both sides. Okay, so let's not romanticize things too much here. And this is my concluding remarks, broad remarks, really. I think Sergio's stories, first of all, shows that agency, migrants navigating, it's something we have to understand, navigating restrictions, so navigating that hostile gadget word invented to prevent people from, or creating these edges, or creating these boundaries of citizenship. Obviously, it's immersed in social cultural context that goes beyond Roma world. That's a given, that's understood. But we have to repeat that over and over, I think. I think also it's important that kinship networks and Roma heterogeneity of groups. It's a complex web of generating social capital, but also meaning making. Sergio is important Chibao because he links a lot of people, okay, not Roma, but also non-Roma. And he's himself an embodiment of Roma heterogeneity, which proves a strength, which proves a super powerful tool. And again, to make sense of Gadjo, but also to kind of be successful in doing what he does. But I think the most important thing is, in terms of human autonomy and cultural autonomy, Sergio narrative, when he talks about it, if you listen to him, I hope I'm not talking on his behalf, I'm just talking about how probably you would get a sense of the person when he talks about this. It's a proud story of resilience, of autonomy. It's a proud story of being able to make it, despite all these, very clever Gadjo at state level and all possible levels try to make life difficult for him and his family. And it's a story of, a very pretty powerful story in that sense. So I think it's something to recognize, but also something to fully recognize as activism per se, full of agency and making the best of the word he was given, so resources in a sense. That's it. Thank you very much, and I hope for some interesting questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We certainly have a few questions here in the chat, but I also would like to encourage the speakers, if they want to join in, if they want to respond to each other's talks, please do so. But I will start maybe with reading out, the first question is directed to Andrzej, Mirga, and it's, could we hear more about how ERIAC, so the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, was established, and what are its goals, and what kind of challenge actually it was to establish it, and what is the significance of this institution for Roma in Europe?
Okay. Well, just to make long story short, we were like 12 people in the alliance for the area. Yes? It was a body of supporters who aimed to establish area. And we had a powerful enemy. It was a network of scholars led by Matras who were opposing. And we met in Paris like 2-3 years before establishing the ERIAC with a Council of Europe guy was advisor to the head of the Council of Europe. And at this meeting in Paris, we were introducing ourselves. And all had like a university degree, PhD or master, and from different countries. And when this guy saw all of us and listened to all of us introducing ourselves, he said, well, I accept all what you say. That was the beginning of a change, yes, in the hearts of the officials from the Council of Europe who saw our potential. And despite all the efforts of Matras and others, the area was accepted. That is the first. The second, we did not hide that we are different, that we are various, that we are coming from different cultures, languages, religions, all over the Europe. And that difference is part of our, let's say, predicament or whatever, how you say. It's our fate, yes? We are among so many different cultures, languages, religions, that difference is our part of life. So we did not hide it, and we did not mystify it as some others non-Roma scholars do. It was simply part of our life, the difference. And in this way, the area functions as a center where all the different people, mostly educated, can act and bring their production and work to change the attitude of the majority. And that, I think, is promising, and that, I think, is the future for us.
Thank you very much. The second question is to Julija Sardelić. You have presented inspiring conceptual tools, Fringes of Citizenship, Invisible Edges of Citizenship, which can be applied to other contexts, not only involving Roma issues and not only related to migration. What I particularly appreciate in your presentation is that Roma in Central, Eastern, Southern, whatever Europe can be used to unravel some universal phenomena. Have you thought about other contexts? Has the situation in New Zealand and its ethnic communities been any inspiration for you? Is there any thread that you could link different contexts on the global scale?
Thank you, Ignacy, for the question. And also I wanted to thank both of the presenters. I mean, I feel that I should come third because I respect both of your work so much that I think, okay, anyway, but I think this is a really excellent question because that's what I was trying to show in my book. I was doing a visiting fellowship in Australia at University of Melbourne when I came across the stolen generation. So basically Aboriginal children that were put into like families that were white because they wanted, the policy was for them to be assimilated. And when I started reading this policy, it really reminded me of something that happened much, much earlier in Europe during the time of Maria Teresa and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and what happened with Roma, very, very similar policy, where Roma children were taken away from their families and put into so-called peasant families so that they would become like ordinary citizens. And I was baffled because the argumentation and the discourse was very, very similar. And then I started like researching other, for example, indigenous minorities, and they were like number of cases, for example, in Canada recently, of course, sterilization of Indigenous First Nations in Canada, and the argumentation that the doctors gave and how this case came about was so similar to, of course, sterilization of Romani women in Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary, that it baffled me. How can basically in different contexts have such similar argumentation? This is one thing that I noticed. The other thing that I was really careful of, and I do find this problematic, is that the position of Roma is framed in terms of Eastern Europe in a way that this is a case of problematic Eastern Europe and problematic human rights in Eastern Europe. And as if I connect to the second question of Camila, basically the problem is that countries like France and the UK have never ever been put under the same scrutiny as, for example, Poland has, as Czech Republic has, as Slovakia has, and so on, and have also had cases of segregation in schools and so on when it comes to Romani children. I do believe that there are certain discourses that states use to marginalize certain population that are very, very different and very unique. All of these populations are very unique. However, the approaches that states many times use are really remarkably similar. Also, for example, we know that, for example, in Hungary, Roma are disproportionately represented in prisons, not because they would be more criminal, but there is more chance for somebody who is Roma to end up in prison. And for example, in New Zealand context, it was also shown that Maori, indigenous population of New Zealand, has more chance to end up in prison for the same crime as somebody who would be settler colonial. So this is the things that I noticed, and they're really somehow coming to analysis that this is something that states do respond, and they have this certain racist response to a certain population. And I think that this is something that you need to also address. There has been fantastic scholarship on activism, Romani activism, for example, also on Romani migration. But I have a feeling that this has been under addressed before. So so thank you very much for this great question.
Thank you, Julia. I will read out maybe the question because as this meeting is recorded, the chat is then not visible. The question was, Western EU countries had their issues and ineffective policies regarding minorities, Roma included, yet they acted as the superior towards the post-socialist EU candidate countries. So my question is, how has this issue appeared during the EU-accession negotiations? Have you come across it or remember from your experience? And how were the narratives about Roma from the CE countries framed by both sides? Were they resisted by civil actors, Roma or NGOs? And to follow on that, how do you think these issues will play out during the Brexit process? So if any of you would like to reply.
I may answer this question, yes. First of all, during accession, most of Roma and nations who were trying to get to the European Union were those who were from the former communist countries, yes. And direction of Roma migration was from the east to west. So the effort to get something from the states and pursue them to comply with the criteria like Copenhagen criteria was for the countries of Eastern Europe or former communist bloc countries and Roma population there. This regard, of course, Italy, France, Spain had their own communities, and there was also a discrimination there, but those Roma did not go to the east. They were staying. Eventually, they were migrating within European Union states at that time. Yes. So the direction was from the east to west. And at that time, the focus and the discussion was how to make Roma citizens organize or self-organize and to pressure governments to do right things. So for example, where Verheugen was a commissioner of the EU, and there were negotiations before 2004 accession, he called directly to Slovakia, to the plenipotentiary, Roma plenipotentiary, Clara Orgovanova, to come to Brussels, because she was not included into delegation of Slovaks, yes? And discuss with them how much structural funds will be devoted to Roma integration in Slovakia. So in the interest of Western countries or old EU countries was to have a policy and measures that would stabilize the Roma community in their countries, in the countries who were accessing, who were asking to join the EU. And that was the philosophy. So we were using this opportunity to pressure governments and to demand what we want. I don't know whether I'm clear enough.
Thank you very much. Julija, go ahead, please.
So I have two questions for both of the presenters. First, for Andrzej, my question to you would be two questions actually. First one is, how do you see Romani activists changing from the socialist Europe to today? And the second question is, how do Roma activists now in current Polish climate, when we see certain rights being curtailed, especially rights of women, how do Romani activists actually basically get involved in this kind of position of like women, like the right to abortion and so on? The second question is for Michał. I have a question. How would you connect your work to work of Rachel Humphreys, who wrote the book Homeland? Because I saw a lot of parallels between your work and her work, and I found it really, really interesting. Is this navigating like this everyday policies and legislation that is put on individuals? So yeah, so these are two my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I will respond to you. Well, during the communism, there was only one organization of Roma established in Tarnów city, and it was established in 50s and active until now, but had no real impact on other developments in the country, because it was a local or regional and established by a small group of people who came from Bieszczady to the central southern part of Poland. Yes, the state. The other peculiarity of the Roma was that there were 70% of Roma were nomads, and this nomadic life was a kind of a prestigious or highly evaluated by Roma themselves. So the state issued a program in 50s to make Roma settled. Yes, that was the essence of the state policy, and productivize them. So they were for 30 years fighting to get Roma settled. Finally, they concluded, but when they were reaching there were no more horses and wagons traveling around, Roma switched horses into horsepower in the cars and became the first who were having cars and continue migration with cars. It was even easier for them to migrate, yes, in this way. So in many ways, Roma resisted the policy of the state of assimilation, and they were state officials, the Communist Party officials, were openly saying, we want to enlarge our influence, Polish influence on Roma to the extent that they will be assimilated and they will cease as a category. Yes, that was the stated objective of the communists at that time. And around 85, 86, during the martial law already, after the martial law, the state gave up and did not continue any particular focus on Roma. They were somehow ignored by the state. Yes, so that's the story, making short. The second question is about current government, yes, and the women who are on the streets and so on. After transition, after Tusk came to power, and after a pilot program for Małopolska region, so southern Poland region, the government adopted, recognized Roma as a national, as an ethnic minority, and there were certain provisions to guarantee rights of minority rights to Roma. And there was established so-called Common Commission of the government, where two Roma, where I was also part of this, among many other representatives of minorities. In this Common Commission, they were addressing Roma issues, yes? And the subcommission of Roma, part of the commission, was established dealing only with Roma, yes? And there were over 20 Roma organizations active from around Poland. And the first program was adopted, the second program was adopted, and the government of Tusk implemented it and committed from his reserve over 100 million over 10 years of implementation of the program. 100 million of Polish zloty. It means 2.5 million per year nearly was committed to Roma integration, which was a great contribution. Yeah? But if you look to the way how Common Commission is functioning, how Minority Commission of the Parliament is acting, with the current government, there is a basic change. They are ignoring, not continuing, or paying less attention at all to the issue of Roma minority and general to the minorities issues in Poland, because this bodies established to deal with minority issues are very irregular. And the current government also canceled, for example, advisor to Prime Minister office who was dealing with the inequality between men and women. It was cancelled at all with this government, as well as the issues of violence against women. It was cancelled. So many Roma, including women, families, yes, attempted to migrate or to use opportunity to migrate abroad. Yes, in some cases, nearly one third or more Roma moved outside. Yes, so migration is debated currently among Roma as the way to get out of the country and avoid this kind of regime as it is now. Simply.
Thank you very much. I will be slowly moving to the end of the meeting, but I would like to just read out the question to Julija here about the contextuality of the fringes of citizenship in Europe, how country-specific and dependent on the political context it is. Here, Agnieszka Radziwinowicz says, I can think of practices of cultural racism in France under Sarkozy with Roma deportations, or under the Tory government in Britain policy of deporting rough sleepers. Is there any EU country that does it right without putting Roma on the fringes of citizenship and could be seen as a good example?
Agnieszka, thank you very much for your question, and no worries about misspelling my name. I mean, if I had don't worry about that at all. I mean, if I had a euro for every time somebody writes Julia instead of Julia, I would be rich today. But anyway, no problem whatsoever. It autocorrects my own name sometimes as well. But no, I think this is an interesting question, and I think that we need to answer it in a way that there are good practices in each country that we have. I wouldn't be able to say that there's any country that does something completely right, because we can see discrimination of Roma basically virtually in all the European Union member states, but also in broader Europe. What I find fascinating is that, for example, in the case Orsos and others versus Croatia, the case of class segregation, the government was arguing, but no, we are not discriminating against Roma, even though they're in separate classes. We do celebrate International Romani Day. So they were saying, at the same time, you can see that multicultural policies can coexist with racism as well, which I find very interesting. But just not to be completely bleak, I think that it's really important to recognize very good practices, and of course ERIAC is one of them, Europe-wide, but also practices on the local level, because there are many, and I do discuss some in my book. But I think that just saying outright that there's a country that does everything right, I don't think there's a such country in Europe or broader, unfortunately. And there's going to be still a lot of work to be done before we can get to this. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. If any of the speakers would like to add something at the end, you are very welcome. If not, we will slowly then move to the end.
Well, yeah, I just want to thank again both Andrzej and Julija for providing very stimulating and enriching frames of debate, because it's about cross-disciplinary really research. I mean, I have all full respect for socio-legal study, and as sociology of law, or however you call it, right? But it's so easy to lose people's agency and how people act and how these acts impact that sociological framework. And I just, I mean, obviously you couldn't expect anything else from an anthropologist than just to re-stress that there's nothing that beats a conversation with someone who tries to make sense and talks about his or her life in a longer time perspective. You're looking at the obstacles, the legal mess people have to navigate in order to make a living, to survive, to feel good with themselves and their families. And I think my last word would be about the problem of migration studies that we are facing very often, and that coupled with a kind of socio-legal lens is that a lot of migration studies suffer from methodological nationalism, where we just think that it's the unit of states, of societies that really matter here, and that we, but in case of Roma, I mean, it's very often in terms of social policy, for example, or how the state acts. The state has a face of a local official or a local mayor or a village, public opinion that makes people makes decision about erecting a wall in a village, and this is not it's obviously the state is behind that, but we have to be careful also not to homogenize the notion of the state, because state is a very complex beast with lots of layers of structures, yeah? and creating these edges of citizenship. And I think these edges are very different when you talk about how laws include, or membership laws exclude, and these edges look very different on a local level, where a local official will say, and like my research colleagues know this very well, where a local official will tell you, well, why do we need these Roma, in a village? It's good they migrate, and by inaction, by these little mundane acts of racism, this official would at the end contribute to growth of racism, normativization of racism, and so on. So I would again call for a very localized view at the level of the city, the village, the urban neighborhood, etc. Because this is where these policies actually are implemented and enacted by people.
Okay. I just agree. I completely agree with you. Everything what you said, I agree 100%. I mean, I did a lot of interviews with individuals who actually face what I call invisible edges of citizenship, but also with people who enact them on different levels. I mean, like, I couldn't agree more with you because, like, basically, invisible edges of citizenship are nothing if they're not enacted. Basically on different levels. I mean, I do write about this as well. My book is going to be open access, so basically I hope we'll be able to continue also the discussion through there. But no, I mean, I agree 100%. I wouldn't be able to add anything.
Thank you. I will just allow myself to read out a comment by Elżbieta Mirga-Wojtowicz to Julia's question about the activity of Roma women in the current strikes in Poland. There are many Roma women who actively support the women's strike. Some Roma women from very traditional communities also support it, but they do it rather discreetly. Just to reply also.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see the comment. Thank you, Elżbieta. Thank you very much.
All right. I think we're yes, of course. One more comment here.
One more comment. I listened to you, Julia, about comparisons between Roma, migrants, and First Nations. Yes, in such countries like Canada or New Zealand or whatever. Yeah. When we were discussing the creation of European Roma Travelers Forum and give a voice to Roma, yes? A proposal of Halonen, President of Finland. Yes? One of the arguments used against the idea of Halonen was that there is a big difference between First Nations and Roma. So we should be paying attention not only to visible similarities, yes, between the two, but also pay attention to maybe not so visible, but important differences between First Nations and Roma. Yes. One of the arguments which were used against was that what was possible with Sami people in Nordic countries it is not possible for Roma in United Europe, where you have 30 countries and 30 Roma living in those countries, yes, of different languages, cultures, and so on. So how you can create legitimate a common voice. And the second was that Samis were controlling territory, and they were the first nation because of that. Yes, and Nordic countries wanted to be nice and to give something to Samis and get back approval of exploiting these resources. Yes, and there is no such thing in the case of Roma, because territories were already exploited or ruled by the majority. So there is no comparison between them. And the third thing is that my daughter was on 8 months field trip in Southern and Latin America, and make a comparison as a PhD between American experience and what is the leitmotif of their associational movement, yes, and in Europe. And the difference is that in the case of Europe, these associated movements of Roma were surrounded around Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whereas in the Latin America experience and Southern America experience, the center was around First Nations. And because of that, in I think Venezuela or something like that, or Colombia, Roma played with First Nation idea, and Chris system, Roma Chris judgment system, was officially recognized by the state because they were playing with the card of First Nation. They are also First Nation. Yes. So the difference is, I think, relevant, and we have to pay attention to that. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just respond very quickly?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. I mean, again, 100% I agree. I quote Anna's work a lot in my book, so I respect her work a lot. So I think she has made really fantastic work in many respects, also with her PhD, but also other things in critical Romani studies. And in no way I would claim that the position of Roma and position of First Nations are the same. This is not my claim at all. My claim, however, is if we look at certain things that states do. So, for example, she focused on the activism, which is fantastic. But like what I try to say is what states do. So when they like basically do certain policies, and these policies there are similarities in that, although I absolutely agree that the position of Roma is unique as it is a position of First Nations. So I do know, I do quote Anna a lot in, I think you were pointing to Anna's work, right? So I think that, her work is really fantastic in this respect. So,
Well, thank you very much to all of the speakers, and also to all the participants who were very active in asking questions. And that was a very rich meeting, and at least for me also. Thank you. And I hope we'll see each other during the next webinar. And I wish you a very good day still today, or a good night's sleep to you, Julija.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this fantastic seminar. It was really a pleasure to be part of it.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best.